Hello, we're going to continue our conversations today about South Carolina history and in particular about who came here, who is a South Carolinian, from whence did they come, who were their forebears. Last week I mentioned if you started tracing your ancestry back to 1670, you would have 16,384 direct forebears. And some people said, oh, how can that happen? It doesn't pop, I've got 2 or 3. Well, just first of all, it doubles every generation. You've got 2 parents, you've got 4 grandparents, you've got 8 grandparents, and it just keeps going on. And so you go back 14 generations, which is what you'd have to do to get to 1670. And yes, you do indeed have more than 16,000 forebears. And I doubt seriously if you've tracked down every one of those lines. Most people have not. We did also discuss the colonial immigration, where people came from, at least 10 European ethnic groups, the Native Americans, the West Africans, 24 ethnicities. Colonial immigration and population growth was spurred by government incentives, land, tools, tax breaks, unlike the goodies we do for industries in the 21st century. State government, in that case colonial government, was involved in business. Now, what about post-revolutionary immigration to the United States, and especially to South Carolina? There had been some small movements prior to the 1840s. For example, Haitian refugees, free persons of color and white, came to southern ports, Charleston, Mobile, New Orleans. Madame Talvon's famous Academy for Young Ladies in Charleston, she was a Haitian refugee. There were Polish refugees from the aborted revolutions of the 1830s, and a small number of northern Europeans, but not a flood of immigrants anywhere. And then between 1830 and 1840, some 600,000 alien passengers, as the immigration folks referred to them, poured into the United States. A third of them were Irish, a quarter of them were German, 15% were English, but few, if any, of those immigrants came to the southern states. Between 1840 and 1850, there were 1.5 million immigrants to this country. Again, Irish, German, English. Southern seaports, Charleston and New Orleans in particular, did attract their share of these newcomers. Immigration to South Carolina after 1775 was totally different. It was individually an initiative of a person wanting to come to South Carolina, no longer any government subsidies, and views of immigrants had changed. South Carolina's welcome mat was not out for many new residents. Charleston, where much of the immigration occurred between 1820 and 1860, received, just in the decade between 1822 and 1835, more than 32,000 people got one-way tickets from New York to Charleston. So obviously, you've got immigrants coming in. Again, mostly German, mostly and particularly Irish. The city's native-born white population declined, as did its enslaved population. In 1860, 16% of the population of the city of Charleston was foreign-born, but it was 30% of the white population were immigrants. That was comparable to Boston and other northern cities. It was overwhelmingly Irish, but in 1856, the rector of St. Stephen's Mission, an Episcopal mission, ordered Bibles in English, German, Spanish, French, Italian, Danish, Welsh, and Norwegian for members of his congregation. There were concerns about the impact of cheap free labor on an economy based on slavery. The submissive, acclimated, non-voting Negro was being replaced with the turbulent, feverish, naturalized foreigner. And if they'd been fleeing revolutions in Europe, they might be bringing dangerous ideas to South Carolina. A strike by Irish railway workers led to demonstrations, threats of violence, and the militia had to be called out to quell the disturbance. And when several Irish took jobs as draymen, a job traditionally held by persons of color, free or slave, there was a free-for-all during which an enslaved Charlestonian lost an eye. A local judge promptly sentenced the immigrants to jail, explaining, slaves also had rights, not the natural rights touted by Northern liberals, but protection devolving from the property rights of their owners. And by the late 1830s, whites could be found scrubbing floors, driving drays, and even waiting on tables. And there are rare references to white servants. Not many, but there are a few. And so what you've really got in Charleston is an urban population, a large percentage of which is poor. Now, how do you absorb these immigrants into what's really a pretty stratified society? In the 1820s and 1830s, a lot of those immigrants that came from New York, those 32,000 we know that came in the decade between mid-1820s and mid-1830s, they didn't stay in Charleston. Many of them purchased tickets and moved on to Mobile and New Orleans. Until 1839, native whites were the largest single group in the poorhouse. Now, the poorhouse is something we don't even think about anymore. But it used to be if you were indigent, if you had no way of support, particularly if you were a woman, you had to go to the poorhouse. Then you were put to work. Until 1839, native whites were the largest single group in the poorhouse. But by 1845, Irish, persons of Irish descent predominated. The charity wards in the city's hospitals were jammed, and anti-Catholicism reared its head from time to time because the Irish were almost to a man and woman Catholic. Perhaps manufacturing was the answer, some folks thought. We'll employ these swarms of immigrants in the mills. The Charleston Courier said that would bring the poor into daily contact with the rich and the intelligent, and thereby improve their lot. William Gregg, who became the state's first great manufacturer over in Graniteville, he said manufacturing could save thousands of poor, ignorant, degraded white people among us, who in this land of plenty live in comparative nakedness and starvation. And, he noted, they would be cheaper labor in the long run than free blacks or hired out enslaved persons. And as an aside on Irish labor, when the railroads were continued from Charleston, or actually from Branchville to Columbia, Irish labor was used because it was cheaper, and going through the swamps it was dangerous. So rather than harm an enslaved person and lose the value, they used cheap Irish labor. And always in South Carolina, demographic reality led the state's white minority to accept the political necessity of the white servant, the Irish driver, or the German peddler in Charleston. One of the interesting settlements of immigrants in the 19th century was Walhalla, a 19th century township created by the German Colonization Society. John Wagner, a very wealthy Charleston merchant, he'd owned a newspaper, and he was a businessman. He found it. He had been a German immigrant, and he purchased land in Oconee County in 1850. German immigrants in Charleston and later others settled the town and farmed the surrounding countryside. By 1860, there were more than 400 Germans living in Valhalla, or Walhalla. It's still pronounced. We call it Walhalla. Europeans would say Valhalla. That's okay. In 1865, a special committee of the General Assembly reported that it was necessary to seek immigrant labor as a substitute for black labor because now that they're free, the colored population will henceforth be totally useless and rather an evil than an advantage to the state. That was not a sentiment unique to South Carolina, but remember in 1865, South Carolina's population was more than 60% African American. The General Assembly appointed John Wagner, the same guy who had created Walhalla, as the state's first commissioner of immigration. And he was charged with recruiting white field hands, white farmers from Europe. He had a pamphlet published, South Carolina, a Home for the Industrious Immigrant. Per the state, it was printed in German, Danish, French, Swedish, and English editions, and it was endorsed by the German Society of New York. The state had better idea about what its immigrants wanted to do than how to recruit them. Number one, they were supposed to work. Number two, they were supposed to teach errant blacks a lesson for abandoning their antebellum work ethic. And three, in a few cases, they were supposed to supplant black labor altogether. Wagner in South Carolina did send a recruiting agent to Europe where he met with hostility and negative opinions about the South. "You just want some new slaves," is the response that he got. Got to get the right kind of immigrant. Northern and Western Europeans were the ideal model. However, Carolinians could see the value in Russians, Poles, and Hungarians. It was important to avoid potential troublemakers who might have been exposed to Northern and Western opinions such as demagogism, socialism, young Americanism, and rowdyism. Not all white Carolinians were happy with the idea. They were concerned that South Carolina would end up with the very dregs of humanity of whom the mother country is but too glad to get rid of. They didn't look back too many generations of why some of their forebears had been here, but that's another story. The original agency in South Carolina was defunct by 1875, but in the 1880s it was reorganized under Dr. E.M. Boykin, and it began to recruit a core of immigrant families. His idea was if you bring a family, not just an individual, the better the chance that they will settle down and become a part of the community. The purpose remained the same, to contribute to economic development and improve South Carolina because they were white, a pure white race with whom our whites will readily intermarry. Boykin cited successful examples. The White River Plantation in Edisto that employed immigrant and local black labor. Immigrants were a stimulant to the Negro labor in competing for work on the plantation and impressing upon their minds there's another source of labor besides Africa. John Irwin of Lancaster was delighted with his Hungarian workforce. He said they were very industrious, prompt, well-disposed, and careful. S.L. Land employed 19 Hungarians and Bohemians in Kershaw County. And J.J. Dargan of Sumter praised his Polish laborers for their willingness to work long hours with little supervision. But there were problems.
All right, I'll be right back.
Immigrants might come to South Carolina, but there was no way to keep them on the plantation. You know, once they're here, they're free. Opposition from whites who preferred black labor. J.J. Cash, a prominent politician, criticized the state for importing into South Carolina a lot of old lager-drinking Dutchmen and spotted-faced Italians, the latter with a hand organ and monkey. We don't want these kind of people here. Now just think of these caricatures of certain ethnicities. The Italian with the hand monkey and the organ grinder, hand organ and the monkey. The lager drinking Dutchman, and that would have been really, could either been a real Dutchman or more likely referring it to a German. Congressman Stanyon Wilson said, 8 years of Negro domination and corruption. We have survived the cyclone, the pestilence, and the earthquake, yet we do not wish to be subjected to the trial of having this mass of European corruption dumped upon this land and into the factories and workshops of our Southland. Whew. Yeah, I wish I hadn't read Miss Lazarus's poem. So the Immigration Commission in South Carolina faded out of existence in the 1880s. But people were still trying. There was an immigration association, and finally in 1904, after 5 tries, there was a bill passed. The director was Ebbie Waters, and the new South Carolina, as it was now called, we're beginning industrialization. We're part of the first of many new Souths. They had a difficult time recruiting European labor. It was true in all southern states. White Southerners were too particular. They wanted only Northern Europeans, we're talking about Scandinavians or Germans, considered Southern Europeans undesirable. And the converse was, yeah, they wanted Northern Europeans, but Northern Europeans didn't care anything about the South. The South was pestilential. It was full of black people. They were not very friendly down here. And the thought that South Carolina should look at Southern Europeans, lumping the Russians and Poles into Southern Europeans, that takes a little bit, but they did, as a source for sharecroppers and eventually landowners. Now, today in the 21st century, you gotta wonder, what on earth were these people thinking? We've already got, particularly in the upcountry, a lot of sharecroppers, native whites that are eking out an existence, and now we're going to bring some more into the state. Interestingly, the Immigration Commission that was founded in 1904 was really high on Russians and Poles because they figured out the climate was the same in South Carolina that it was in Russia and Eastern Europe. I'm not sure which geographic atlas they were using. I don't recall winters where everything froze and we went by sleigh, but anyway, they said that. They actually said that. But they said the agricultural methods were too, which meant they were primitive. A lot of it was still hand labor. Waters' choice of Europeans was interesting because much of the rest of the country considered Southern Europeans a brownish mongrel race. However, once they got to the American South and to South Carolina, they were white. Again, South Carolina is still 60% African American at the turn of the century. So regardless of from whence they came, they added a number white in the column to maybe redress the population imbalance. According to press reports, at the turn of the century, there were 500 Scandinavians living in Aiken County. There were 30 Finns in a logging camp in Hardyville, and the biggest success was a little place called Happyville. Happyville was one of the Commission's prides and joy. It was designed to attract Jewish immigrants to South Carolina. The pamphlet was published in German and Yiddish, and it described South Carolina as the garden country of America. A desirable place for the homemaker, the merchant, the orchardist, the dairyman, stock raiser, businessman, manufacturer, health seeker, and tourist. 2 New Yorkers, Charles Weintraub and Morris Latterman, purchased the Sheffield Phelps plantation in Aiken County, 2,200 acres. complete with livestock, implements, buildings, and by 1906 there were 10 families, 15 individuals in residence in this place now called Happyville. It was described as a colony, and in many ways it was. The first year was a disaster. A late frost and heavy rains ruined the crop. Rains also washed away a dam that settlers had built to supply water power for a grist mill, cotton gin, and sawmill. The second year was a little bit better. They connected with Aiken's Jewish community, which was puzzled by the Russians' lack of agricultural experience. A school was erected for children, but financial miscalculations, internal dissension, and another bad crop doomed the enterprise. They were described by local folks in Aiken as socialists and thinkers and poets, not farmers. Happyville was sold in 1908, so you've got a 4-year plan there, and most colonists returned to New York or New Jersey. After Happyville, South Carolina seemed to give up trying to attract new immigrants. Individually, persons from Greece and Syria and Lebanon immigrated prior to the U.S. closing the Golden Door in the 1920s. In the 1940s, in 1940, in the census, except for the Utah, South Carolina had the smallest percentage of foreign-born residents of any state in the Union. Now, if you talk to folks of our generation, I don't care what town you lived in, whether you lived in Florence or Columbia, you'll talk about, well, the Greeks owned the restaurants. Sometimes it was Syrian Lebanese, but they were considered, folks from that part of the world were just all lumped together. And so, whether you're talking about restaurants on May Street in Columbia, or in Florence, or in Hardeeville, that was almost true. Particularly immigrants at the turn of the century between then and 1920 began to dominate the restaurant trade in South Carolina. Now, what about today? Well, here we are in 2021, but we don't have the results of the 2020 census, but we do have the result of the 2010 census. And we had, in that census, where South Carolina, the total population was about 3.8 million, we had 116,000 people who were immigrants, who were not born in the U.S. The largest percentage of those came from Latin America, about 43%. The second largest group, about 25%, came from Asia. And the third percentage was European. Now, trying to figure out where in Europe the census didn't break that down that large. But in asking people what language they spoke other than English, you see Arabic, you see Czech, you see Danish, you see German, Greek, Irish, Italian, Lithuanian, Norwegian, Portuguese, Slovak, Swiss, of course Swiss could be German, French, or Italian. So Ukrainian. So South Carolina in the 21st century was becoming more multicultural. But folks, it was not as multicultural, we still are not there, as where we were 2 centuries ago in South Carolina prior to the American Revolution. And I think I'll stop there, and next week we'll talk about the Carolina backcountry.